What about cap and trade? How does this work? So we're going to go back to the diagram that I drew earlier, but first let me just tell you kind of intuitively how this works. It's very similar to the Uniform Performance Standard with one important difference, right? I might say I got to reduce pollution by 100 tons. I'm going to give you, right, permits in the amount that basically require you to reduce pollution by 50 tons. I'm going to give you permits in the amount that require you to reduce by 50 tons. But instead of, right, just kind of keeping that at 50-50 the way I did with the Uniform Performance Standard, I'm going to let you guys trade. And you, between the two of you, can sort of figure out, right, how to allocate that responsibility for control so that we meet the 100-ton standard. So firms are going to, under those conditions, they'll buy and sell these allowances, these kind of permits, right until those marginal costs are equal across firms. And we'll just look at the graph briefly again so that we can see that that's the case. And so just like the tax, right, where everybody's setting their marginal costs equal to the tax, and thus the marginal costs are equal across all firms, because firms are trading, right, and they've got we end up with this equilibrium permit price. In the same way, the marginal costs end up equal across all firms, right? They're all equal to the market price of a permit, okay? It's that P star instead of a Q star. So the equilibrium allocation, this is again something I mentioned briefly earlier. One of the nice things is it doesn't matter where I start. So let's go back to the graph, and we'll kind of think about this, right? If I think of myself as starting at 50-50, my dashed line, the vertical line here, well, where are my incentives? Well, B is the high-cost firm, A is the low-cost firm, so B would rather not abate that unit, and he would be willing to pay something to A to abate that unit, and A would be willing to accept something, some compensation, right? For A, as long as the compensation was greater than her marginal cost, she'd be happy, and for B, as long as the payment was less than his marginal cost, he'd be happy. So we get these kind of mutually beneficial gains from trade until we get back to that point of intersection. Right, and again, if I started out at 20-80, right, give firm A 20 tons of responsibility and B 80 tons, the same thing would be true. I would just get more trading, right? B's costs are just even higher than A's at that level, and so the incentive is even stronger to trade, again, until we kind of move to the point of intersection, right? Or I could start out at 100-0, right? Give firm A all the responsibility and firm B nothing, right? And then I could find, right, I'd find these gains from trade, and we'd end up back at 60-40. So this nicety, right, again, it's nice and it's tough, right, because politically it matters very much to firms who gets what in the beginning, right? So I would really rather be the firm that gets a bunch of permits and gets to sell them to other firms than be the firm that, right, gets a small number and has to buy, right, in order to kind of do my least cost thing. And so it matters a lot to firms distributionally, but it doesn't matter really at all unless we have a story about market permit in the permit market, right? And we haven't seen empirically that kind of situation in very many actual applied settings. So that would be an unusual thing to happen. And not only that, regulators are pretty wise to that possibility. And so, for example, in the actual SO2 trading program that EPA set up in 1990 that operated until 2008, EPA just sort of kept a certain number of permits aside and would auction them each year to prevent, right, any single firm from trying to kind of corner the market, keep out new entrants and that kind of thing. Okay, so we might worry about market power, but in general it hasn't been an issue. And as long as we don't have that, however we allocate these things in the beginning, we're still going to get to 60-40, right, because we're taking advantage of those incentives between firms for those mutually beneficial gains from trade. So, I mean, politically, that can cause some nice situations too, right? So in 1990, when the George H.W. Bush administration was getting ready to implement what it became the sulfur dioxide trading program, there were some standouts, some states that, right, in the Senate in particular, were really resisting, right, these changes in the Clean Air Act that would make it more stringent. And in particular, states that were resisting were states that were in sort of Appalachia, where there either was coal mining, a lot of big coal industry, or a lot of electric utilities that were using high sulfur coal, or both. And one particular standout was the state of Ohio, and then Senator Glenn ended up getting a very, very large sort of chunk of the national permits for the program in order to buy his support for the program in the Senate, which was essential to it passing. And again, that was sort of nice for Ohio utilities because they were in the position where they started out from, this sort of nice big permit allocation, and they could sell some permits right in the beginning and make some money. But it didn't matter ultimately, right, for achieving the cost-effective allocation across firms, right? So you can like or dislike that story, but in general, it's sort of something that's appealing about cap and trade programs from politicians' perspective because they have something to give out, right? We're not just, right, it's not just the stick, but there's also some carrots. Okay, so how does this work? right? Again, the equilibrium allocation is independent of the initial allocation. That could be a nice thing. Unlike the tax, the regulator doesn't have to know firms' marginal costs, right? This is something that's a little bit magical about cap and trade programs, right? When I said you got to, in order to get Q star, I kind of had to know something about the costs in order to get to Q star with a tax. But if I just sort of know, if I set Q, I know I'm going to get Q. That's my cap, right? I'm going to enforce the cap. And I don't have to know anything about individual firms' marginal cost curves in order to know where, right, whether I'm going to achieve Q or not. I get it, right, because the firms are trading with each other. So unlike the tax, I have this certainty over the quantity. I don't have the certainty over ultimately the price per ton, right? So the equilibrium permit price is going to end up wherever it ends up, right, causing some uncertainty for firms in terms of their compliance costs, whereas the tax, right, I pin down the price, but I don't know the quantity. Okay, is everybody clear on that distinction? Okay. So that's the story, the kind of short-run cost-effectiveness story, right? That's why we tend to like these. Again, all else equal, for the same standard achieved, we tend to like the taxes and the permits over a uniform standard, a technology standard that doesn't take advantage of these cost differences across firms. Okay. So, all right, what about the second question, right? What's the incentive to kind of bring down the cost of pollution control over time? Again, all else equal, we'd kind of like to have a standard or some kind of pollution control policy that would help us do this, okay, that would provide incentives to do this. And I'm not going to go through the theory on this, but I'll tell you what it says, and that is, right, when we're in this long-run setting, and my choice of abatement technologies is not fixed, and I can choose, right, to change my whole factory or change my pollution control process, I can lower my abatement costs by developing or adopting new technologies, but I'm going to have to usually make a pretty big upfront capital cost to do that. So an example would be, right, what if all of a sudden there's on the market now there's a new, more efficient scrubber, right? So its operating costs are lower, but if I want to do that, if I want to get those sort of lower operating costs of that scrubber, I have to buy the new thing, right? I have to retire my old one and I have to buy a new one. And so firms are always in the position where they're trying to weigh those kinds of decisions. Should I invest in the cost-reducing technology or should I not, right? And it depends on the cost savings versus the capital cost of the investment, plus discounting, right? I have to think about this thing lasting over a long period of time. Okay, so it turns out that the market-based policies, because they put a price on pollution, right? Because every ton that I abate, I have to pay some cost for. Because of that, I'm going to provide these greater incentives for technological change than what I see under either type of command and control policy, the technology standard or the uniform performance standard. Again, we can go through the theory on that. I'd rather kind of get along to some examples of market-based approaches and talk about how that's worked out in practice, but I'm happy to answer questions about that too. Some other things to worry about. Okay, so one thing, what are some potential downsides here? Okay, one would be what I would just going to call the non-uniform mixing problem. So the way I've talked about this, and even the way I drew that marginal damage function earlier when we talked about negative externalities, I'm sort of saying, right, that every firm has the same damages from pollution, that it doesn't matter where the pollution is emitted, right? I'm not causing sort of differential marginal damages to society. And that's true in some situations, right? So for carbon emissions, it really doesn't matter whether I emit a ton in Beijing or a ton in Boston, right, or a ton in Annapolis. It's causing the same essential quantity of damages in the long run, right, from sort of adding to the stock of carbon in the upper atmosphere. But it's not true of a lot of other pollutants, right? It's not true of most water pollutants. It's not true of some air pollutants. Sometimes where the pollution is emitted matters very much, right, for how much damage it causes. And in that situation, we can get into these tricky situations with market-based approaches, right? Again, if I take a uniform standard and I say everybody has to cut by 50 tons, okay? It's not necessarily true that everybody is then exposed to the same amount of pollution because there was some variation, right? Before I had the standard, there was some variation. There's still going to be variation exposure to pollution. But if I implement a market-based approach and I move around, right, from 50-50 to 60-40, then the place that had only 40 tons of emissions abatement has less abatement relative to its baseline than does the place that has 60 tons. And if it turns out that those high-cost firms, right, the ones that would do less abatement under the market-based approach, because it's more costly for them to do so, are also high-damage firms, right, where pollution control gives us big benefits, then this can really kind of mess up the efficiency criterion as well. Then now we're talking about changing the benefits of pollution control because we've redistributed the pollution spatially. Okay, and so that can then cause us some problems. And so what are some solutions to that? Well, the solutions are conceptually straightforward, but have sort of turned out to be much harder to implement in practice than anyone might have imagined when people started writing about this back in the 1960s. And so the solutions are things kind of like exchange rates. Okay, and so this is something that Jim has written about really interestingly, especially thinking about taxes, right? You could either directly tie a tax to the marginal damages at your location. Okay, that's one thing you could do. Or if it was reasonably straightforward to set up sort of a zonal trading system, you know, if I'm talking about you know, ozone generated by NOx and VOC emissions in Southern California, and I know the prevailing winds are off the coast from west to east, then I sort of wouldn't like to increase emissions, right, in the kind of western areas, right, and decrease them in the eastern areas necessarily, right, because I'm just sort of blowing that pollution over. So I might have some rules of thumb, right, kind of regional, spatial rules of thumb that I can use to create a tax system that taxes, you know, in some simple, straightforward way, these sort of more damaging emissions at a higher rate. Okay, so that can either be firm-specific, location-specific, it could be zones. There's all different kinds of ways of working that out. There could be an intertemporal aspect to this, right? If it matters more in the summer than it does in the winter, if it matters more in the middle of the day than it does in the night, right? So you can think about these different sort of types of taxes to accommodate that system. Okay, so let me give you an example of how this would work with cap and trade. So this is a paper from back in 2005. It's a group of scholars at Carnegie Mellon who did this really neat thing, and they were looking at the problem of combined sewer overflows. Everyone know what CSOs are, combined sewer overflows, right? So if you live in a place that doesn't have separate storm sewers from the sanitary sewage system, then what happens when you have lots of rainfall all at once, like what happens often in Austin, Texas, although we do have separate stormwater systems, the sanitary system receives all of that storm runoff and it overwhelms the capacity of the wastewater treatment plant to treat that waste. And so essentially the plants in these areas have permits from the EPA to just kind of open the gates, right? And then you get a mix of sort of storm water and raw sewage going into the receiving waters until, right, the flow is sufficiently reduced so that the plant can begin to operate again. And so these are called combined sewer overflows, or CSOs, and they're common in, you know, like some northeastern cities in parts of the Midwest where it's just hasn't been sort of technically feasible / cost effective to like dig up sort of, you know, central Manhattan and install a new storm sewer system and so on. Okay, so it's not everywhere, but there are parts of the country that have this more than others. So what they did is they looked at the Upper Ohio River Basin and the CSOs in the Upper Ohio River Basin. And in the basin, there are 70 municipal sewage systems that receive runoff during rainfall and have these CSO permits. And the damages that they were looking at were from elevated levels of bacteria, biological oxygen demand, total suspended solids during these CSO events, okay, that into receiving water bodies. And so the marginal damages from these depend on, in their sort of simplified model, right? Somebody asked earlier what goes into that. Again, the sort of flow and some other hydrological characteristics of the receiving water, as well as the exposed population. Okay, so are we talking about big cities or rural areas and so on? And so what they do is they set up this system of exchange rates. Okay, so these are the 8 of the 70 systems, the kind of 8 biggest ones. And this matrix is just saying, okay, here's regulated source I, 1 through 8, Clairton through Youngstown, okay? And then here's so those are the rows, and then the columns are the same thing. So 1 here corresponds to the city of Clairton, right? A 2 corresponds to the city of Greensburg. And the ones across the diagonal of the matrix is just saying, right, this is sort of own trading, right? If Clairton were to trade with Clairton, if Greensburg were to trade with Greensburg, if McKeesport were to trade with McKeesport. So that's why those are 1s. But everything else in the matrix is giving you this kind of exchange rate that you would want to use, taking into account the marginal damages at the location of each of these sources. All right, that's the exchange rate you would want to use in a trade. So for example, I circled this, right, Morgantown trading with Pittsburgh, because Pittsburgh is number 5, so that's column 5. And it turns out that the damages of emissions in Morgantown are higher than the damages from emissions in Pittsburgh. So if Morgantown wants to buy, right, it wants to offset 1 ton of its kind of emissions reduction responsibility by purchasing permits from Pittsburgh, it has to buy sort of 4.5 tons for every ton that it wants to reduce of its own responsibility. Okay, and so you can read each of these numbers like that, right? If they're smaller, right, then it goes the other way. They can buy less than 1 ton of emissions, right, from another setting rather than reduce it themselves. And so they set up these exchange rates, and you could say, well, why don't they just prohibit trades between Morgantown and Pittsburgh, right? If the damages are higher in Morgantown, and one could do that, you know, you can set those kinds of constraints in the system. The problem in a system like this would be, well, then, you know, Morgantown could trade with McKeesport, and then McKeesport could trade with Pittsburgh, right? You'd have to really be very clever, right, in sort of thinking about how to block, right, the movement of pollution toward the cheaper area. And so, right, the system of exchange rates kind of takes care of that, and it says, well, how much is it really worth, right, relative to the damages? How much is it really worth? and then it sort of sets those ratios, just like an exchange rate does, right, if you're trading currency in another country. And so this is in theory how it would work, and there are systems that use these. So a couple to think about or look at if you're interested in this would be the Minnesota River Phosphorus Trading Program. Has a very carefully, right, again, this is an area where, right, economists are working closely with water quality modelers to understand these impacts, what's important, what are the characteristics that are important, and kind of coming up with these matrices of trading ratios. So the Minnesota River Phosphorus Trading Program is one. The Chesapeake Bay TMDL, right, that was issued back when I was at RFF, I don't know, 2010 maybe, I think. There are 3 states, Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, that have set up trading programs that also, right, there's this sort of systems of trading ratios that I think are being used in those programs as well, and there are others. Okay. So that's how it would work. In theory, turns out to be, somewhat complicated to implement in practice. Another thing to worry about when we think about cap and trade programs or taxes is monitoring enforcement. So a question came up earlier, kind of how do you kind of monitor and enforce regulations like this? And it turns out that while abatement costs tend to be the largest share of social costs when we think about environmental regulation, the kind of monitoring, enforcement, and associated administrative costs to governments are the second largest category. Okay, so to give you a sense of scale, with the SO2 trading program that we'll talk about in a minute, that was running from 1990 to 2008, if a firm adopted a scrubber to comply with that, it would have cost on the order of tens to even maybe hundreds of millions of dollars to purchase that scrubber and install it, and probably several $1,000,000 per year to operate it for an individual firm. And in order to enforce that regulation, EPA had to install continuous emissions monitoring in all of the regulated electric utilities stacks, right? So they could know in real time exactly how much pollution was coming out, so they could check and see, right, were firms complying with their permit allocations. And that cost, several $100,000 to install and about $50,000 per year to operate. So it's not nothing, right? It's not negligible. It can be a big cost, but on the scale, so relative to abatement costs, it's relatively small. Okay, so they tend to be small relative to abatement costs, but it's still, and again, if you can fit 2,500 electric, generating units in the United States on a spreadsheet. But if we're talking about, 140 million cars, or however, hundreds of millions of households are heating homes with home heating oil. But if I wanted to try and do a market-based approach with a much more diffuse, sort of, very large, sort of numerous population of regulated entities, then these monitoring enforcement costs of a cap and trade or even a tax-based approach might be very high. Okay, so you have to sort of think about the scale of the regulation if I want to compare these things. So, I guess the point I want to make is that on the cost effectiveness criterion, the market-based approaches are just, in most cases, going to be better. Okay, and we'll talk about some exceptions to that in a second. But on the monitoring enforcement dimension, there's sort of no clear winner. Probably the command and control approaches are cheaper on average, and so you'd want to weigh that against, right, the savings and abatement costs, which are often going to swamp those savings and monitoring enforcement costs, but not always. Okay. So are the traditional approaches ever preferable? That's sort of leading into this question. So I would say under 3 different conditions. One is when I really have these severe kind of non-uniform mixing problems. So I remember again, there was this debate we talked briefly about yesterday about over a new arsenic standard under the Safe Drinking Water Act going back to 1999, 2000. And at the time, an economist who I know well, but I can't imagine what he was thinking when he wrote this, wrote an article proposing, well, we should have trading, right? And some communities should have high arsenic levels and others could have low, and we could just sort of meet regional standards. And those highly non-uniformly mixed problems, right, where the damages are very, very specific, right, to the location of emissions or exposure, are really just not well suited, right, for a market-based approach, right? You really run this risk of having the sort of high damage firms doing less abatement or the high, right, or vice versa, and that's not at all going to be what we want for efficiency. So another example of that would be toxic waste, right? I would never say, well, let's just trade toxic waste dumps, right? Because all that matters is the total amount of toxic waste produced by the United States. Well, we know that that's not the case, right? The spatial location of that thing matters very much, so we want to be real careful in those situations. A second situation in which we'd prefer the traditional approaches is, a single control technology is just highly effective and everybody would kind of do the same thing anyway, right? Abatement costs are very similar across firms. Again, if you think about those marginal cost curves, the only reason we had that space between the curves when we had some trading versus the 50-50 split was because the cost curves were different. I drew one steeper than the other, right, or one higher or one lower. And if that's not the case and everybody has essentially the same cost, then I don't really get any bang for the buck of using a market-based approach, and I might incur some extra costs to do that. So then, in that case, it's not a great idea. So a good example of that historically has been double-hulled oil tankers, right? So what do we do to kind of prevent another Exxon Valdez? Well, one thing that we did was under the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 is that we required the sort of phasing in of these double-hulled oil tankers. Well, if you'd asked firms to meet some standard, right, that had to do with reducing the probability of another spill, they would pretty much universally have chosen double-hulled oil tankers, right? So why go through the trouble of doing some kind of trading, right, or some kind of tax system when that works just fine and is cost-effective for most of the regulated entities? And then finally, if the number of regulated entities is really high, again, that's this difference between 2,500 electric generating units regulated by a cap-and-trade system versus 230 million cars or 140 million households, that kind of thing, right? Then we have this problem of monitoring and enforcement. It becomes very expensive to think about implementing. And so as the problem gets more and more diffuse like that, right, then we sort of start to move away from market-based approaches in our kind of mental toolkit of what's available to us. The only thing I would say there is that, I often say, well, kind of for now, right? So we see, especially in the aftermath of the Volkswagen, right, this regulatory incident with the German firm Volkswagen, people talk about, well, gee, maybe we should be testing auto emissions on the road, and we just combine license plate recognition technology with, right, sort of field emissions testing, which some states already do, right, to either complement or substitute for some of their kind of in-house emissions testing regulations. Maybe, right, technology, if those technologies combine in a way in which it's cost effective to regulate emissions in some sort of very diffuse way through a tax or something like that, well, then maybe it would make sense. But in general, the sort of more diffuse the pollution problem, the greater the number of regulated entities, the less it is likely that you would want to go with the market-based. Okay, so this is my list of some examples of market-based environmental policies that have been tried. British Columbia has a carbon tax, right? I think does anybody know, $25 a ton, something like that. It's set somewhere reasonably close to what we would think would be, at least from U.S. estimates, the social cost of carbon. It's pretty new. I don't know of any good empirical analyses yet. I know there are some estimates. BC has its own estimates of how it's reduced carbon emissions, but it's hard for me to say how good those estimates are. Lots of experiments with cap-and-trade programs. So again, carbon dioxide, right, there's a market in the European Union. There's one in California. There's RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative on the East Coast. There's the SO2 trading program. There's been some NOx trading in the United States. So a fair number now of examples in air pollution control, especially in industrialized countries. As I mentioned earlier, a good example of the tax approach, or the kind of Pigouvian tax approach, are these unit charges for municipal solid waste, or pay-as-you-throw systems. A lot of communities have adopted them. There are some good studies showing that they reduce the sort of volume of the solid waste stream. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, if you don't provide curbside recycling when you do this, right, then you may just not be doing yourself a favor, right? You increase incentives for illegal disposal and so on. So there are things to think about other than just, right, what to tax and how much. You got to sort of think about the whole context. Probably the most successful experiments with these have been individual tradable fishing quotas. Pete, I'm sure, knows much more about those than I do, but New Zealand manages something like 90% or 85 or 90% of its the stocks within its exclusive economic zone using these tradable quota systems. In the United States, there are a lot of species that are managed this way too, although it's been much more controversial, and it's come and it's gone, and it's been banned and it's been unbanned. But Gulf snapper right now, Pacific halibut, those are two very good examples and pretty well-studied examples. Water quality trading, I mentioned the Minnesota River program and the Chesapeake Bay nitrogen phosphorus markets for a lot of reasons that we can go into if anybody's interested. These things have not taken off the way we thought they might, perhaps due to some of the skepticism that Jim expressed yesterday about how ready we are for these things. But that's another set of examples. And there's a reason that I've sort of listed them in this order. Wetlands banking, that came up yesterday, tradable development rights. I would put this as sort of maybe with individual tradable fishing quotas at the top, but then I would sort of put this list in this order as sort of moving away from the easy cases toward the much harder cases, and the cases where it's not clear that we have actually done sort of generated net benefits for the environment in comparison to what we would have done with more of a traditional prescriptive approach. And I think it's very hard to say. I don't think we know nearly enough, right, about what's happened. But if you think about the essential problem here, as we sort of move from the easy cases to the hard cases, I'm just going to skip through this and sort of just go to my summing up slide. What we're doing is we're sort of moving away from those clearly, sort of uniformly mixed problems, right? The problems where it really doesn't matter where the control takes place, or in the resource case, sort of doesn't really matter where the conservation takes place, or it doesn't really matter, right? One kind of piece of a wetland is tradable, fully tradable and equivalent, right, to a piece someplace else, or a different kind of wetland. So, right, there's all these things to like about market-based approaches. We like that they're cost-effective. We like that they have these long-run incentives for technological change. We like that we see examples in practice where empirically we've actually been able to estimate what have been the cost savings relative to other approaches, right? What have been the environmental impacts. We like all that, okay? But there are these applications on the frontier. There's this impulse, right, that when all I have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right, that to say, well, it worked, right, for air pollution control, and so now we should have wetlands mitigation banking, and we should trade development rights and species habitat, and so on. But as we move to these newer kind of, and I don't mean new environmental problems in the sense that the problem is new, but, right, that I'm sort of taking the market-based approach to a new set of problems that I haven't tried before, then we have these new challenges. And it's not that I think I may be somewhat more optimistic, for example, on the water pollution case than what Jim expressed yesterday. I think there's been a ton of progress made in this interdisciplinary work, right, trying to understand how these things work, how they might work better, and really trying things on the ground. But I also think, right, that the key problem is that for these non-uniform damages, the markets have to have constraints, and they have to be designed really carefully, right, in order to not make things worse, right, not just make things more costly, but actually make things worse in terms of benefits. And so the design of those constraints requires these inputs from the natural and physical sciences. It requires, right, this kind of working together across disciplines in ways that I don't think have happened either in regulatory agencies or in academics or both, to the degree that they would really need to in order to make these things fly pretty well.